The Forgotten Empire of Venice before the tourists arrived. Part 1. Welcome to the Swamp Empire. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back about 1,000 years to when Venice wasn't a tourist trap filled with overpriced gondola rides and people taking selfies with pigeons. No, we're talking about when Venice was basically the medieval equivalent of a mafia state built on a swamp. So go ahead and dim those lights, grab your favorite blanket, and settle in for a nice long journey through the most unlikely empire in European history. Now, before we dive into this watery mess of politics and plague, let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. Imagine if someone decided to build an entire civilization on a collection of muddy islands in a lagoon and somehow turn that into one of the most powerful empires in the world. That's Venice for you. A place where logic went to die, but somehow money grew on trees, or rather, grew on salt. Our story begins in the 5th century, when the Roman Empire was having what you might call a bit of a moment. And by moment, I mean complete civilizational collapse. The barbarians were having a field day across Europe, and the people living in what's now northern Italy were getting pretty tired of being pillaged every Tuesday. So naturally, they did what any reasonable person would do when faced with marauding hordes. They ran away to live in a swamp. The Veneti, as they were called, packed up their belongings and headed out to the most uninhabitable place they could find. The lagoon was basically a collection of marshy islands that flooded twice a day, had no fresh water, no farmland, and was populated mainly by mosquitoes and the occasional, very lost seagull. Perfect, they thought. Nobody's going to want to conquer this soggy nightmare. And you know what? They were absolutely right. The barbarians took one look at these people living on stilts in the middle of a swamp and said, "You know what? Let's just leave the crazy marsh people alone." It was like natural selection, but for real estate. Now, you might be wondering how exactly one builds a civilization on a bunch of muddy islands in a lagoon. Well, the Venetians figured out pretty quickly that if you drive enough wooden poles into the mud, you can build on top of them. Millions and millions of wooden poles, actually. The entire city of Venice is basically sitting on what amounts to the world's largest underwater forest. They chopped down half of Slovenia and Croatia to build their little water kingdom. But here's where it gets interesting. These swamp dwellers realized they had stumbled onto something pretty valuable: salt. Now, I know salt doesn't sound particularly exciting to us today, but back in the early medieval period, salt was basically white gold. It was the only way to preserve food, and everyone needed it to survive. The Venetians found themselves sitting on natural salt pans, and suddenly their soggy exile started looking pretty profitable. So while the rest of Europe was busy hitting each other with swords and dying of various plagues, the Venetians were quietly becoming the medieval equivalent of drug dealers, except their drug was a food preservative. They cornered the salt market and started getting obscenely wealthy. And you know what wealthy people do? They start getting ideas above their station. By the 8th century, these former refugees had organized themselves into something resembling a government. They elected their first Doge in 697 AD. Now, Doge sounds like a cute internet meme, but it actually comes from the Latin dux, meaning duke. Except these weren't your typical medieval dukes sitting in stone castles. No, the Venetian Doge lived in a palace that was basically a very fancy house on stilts. The first Doge was a guy named Paolo Lucio Anafesto, and honestly, we don't know much about him, except that he probably spent most of his time trying not to fall into the lagoon. Being the ruler of a bunch of muddy islands wasn't exactly a prestigious position at the time. It was more like being elected mayor of a very expensive trailer park. But the Venetians were nothing if not ambitious. They looked around at their watery kingdom and thought, you know what this swamp needs? A navy. Which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. If you live surrounded by water and your neighbors keep trying to invade you by land, why not just sail around and invade them instead? This is where the story gets really interesting. Because the Venetians didn't just build any navy, they built the most technologically advanced, ruthlessly efficient, and absolutely terrifying naval force in the Mediterranean. They were like the maritime equivalent of that quiet kid in school who nobody paid attention to until one day he shows up with a rocket launcher. The key to Venetian naval supremacy wasn't just their ships, though those were pretty impressive. It was their complete and utter lack of romantic notions about warfare. While other medieval powers were still obsessed with chivalry and honor and all that knightly nonsense, the Venetians approached war like a business transaction. They asked themselves practical questions like, how can we kill the most people with the least effort? And what's the most cost-effective way to destroy our enemy's economy? This pragmatic approach to violence served them well. By the 9th century, they had established themselves as the dominant maritime power in the northern Adriatic. They controlled the trade routes, they controlled the salt, and most importantly, they controlled who got to sail through their waters. Cross the Venetians, and you might find your merchant ships mysteriously sinking on their way to market. Pure coincidence, of course. Now, let's talk about the Byzantine Empire for a moment, because Venice's relationship with Byzantium was like a medieval soap opera. The Byzantines were the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, and they considered themselves the rightful heirs to Roman glory. They looked at Venice and saw a useful puppet state, a bunch of swamp merchants who could handle trade while the real empire focused on more important things like theological debates and palace coups. The Venetians, meanwhile, looked at the Byzantines and saw an opportunity. They were perfectly happy to pretend to be loyal subjects while quietly building their own power base. It was a relationship built on mutual deception and greed, which is basically the foundation of all successful medieval diplomacy. In 992, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II granted the Venetians a crucible, basically a golden decree that gave them incredible trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire. They could trade tax-free in Constantinople and other major Byzantine ports. It was like being handed a license to print money, except the money was actual Byzantine gold coins. The Venetians took this imperial favor and ran with it. They established trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, created their own banking systems, and started acting less like humble subjects and more like an independent power. They were getting rich, getting confident, and most importantly, getting ideas. By the year 1000, Venice wasn't just a collection of muddy islands anymore. It was becoming something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a maritime commercial empire. They had transformed from refugee swamp dwellers into the medieval equivalent of a multinational corporation with its own army. And like most successful corporations, they were about to discover that success breeds enemies. The Normans in South Italy were getting annoyed by Venetian dominance in Mediterranean trade. The emerging Italian city-states like Pisa and Genoa were starting to challenge Venice's monopoly on Eastern trade. And most concerningly of all, the Byzantines were beginning to realize that their humble Venetian allies had become powerful enough to be actual rivals. This is where our story really takes off, because Venice was about to enter what historians call its golden age, which, in Venetian terms, meant roughly 3 centuries of systematic conquest, economic manipulation, and the occasional bit of light genocide, all while maintaining the pretense that they were just humble merchants trying to make an honest living in their swamp kingdom. But that's a story for our next part, when we'll explore how the Venetians turned the Fourth Crusade into history's most successful corporate takeover, and why investing in Venice was literally a matter of life and death. Until then, keep those eyes heavy and let the gentle sound of lapping lagoon waters carry you off to sleep.
Part 2. The Crusade Business Model. So, we're back in our watery empire, and it's now the early 1200s. Venice has spent the past couple of centuries perfecting what we might call the art of profitable patriotism. They've mastered the delicate balance of appearing piously Christian while simultaneously conducting business with anyone who had gold to spend, including Muslims, Jews, and the occasional pagan who wandered into port with interesting cargo. By this time, the Doge wasn't just some guy trying not to fall into the lagoon anymore. He was Enrico Dandolo, and this man was about to orchestrate one of the most spectacular bait-and-switches in medieval history. Picture your typical medieval ruler. Young, athletic, probably decent with a sword, definitely fond of dramatic speeches about honor and glory. Now forget all of that. Dandolo was 90 years old, completely blind, and approached warfare like a very patient accountant planning a hostile takeover. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to be a straightforward holy war. Pope Innocent III had called for another expedition to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims because apparently the first 3 crusades hadn't quite gotten the job done. The plan was simple: gather a bunch of knights, sail to Egypt, conquer Alexandria, and then march triumphantly into the Holy Land. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything, as it turned out, but in the most profitable way imaginable, at least if you happen to be Venetian. The crusading knights needed ships, lots of ships, and there was really only one place in Europe where you could commission a fleet large enough to transport an entire army across the Mediterranean: Venice. So, a delegation of French nobles sailed to the lagoon to negotiate with Doge Dandolo. They probably expected to deal with some humble merchant princes who would be honored to serve the cause of Christ. Instead, they found themselves across a negotiating table from a blind 90-year-old who could calculate compound interest in his sleep and had absolutely no romantic illusions about holy wars. Dandolo listened politely to their grand speeches about reclaiming Jerusalem, nodded at appropriate moments, and then quoted them a price that would have made a Byzantine tax collector weep with envy: 85,000 silver marks for transportation and supplies. In today's money, we're talking about roughly $50 million. The Crusaders did some quick math and realized they were a bit short, like massively, catastrophically short. They had maybe a third of what Dandolo was demanding. Now, any reasonable person would have maybe negotiated a payment plan or possibly found some cheaper shipping options, but Dandolo had a better idea. He suggested that instead of paying the full amount in silver, the Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice with a few small military projects. Just some light conquering to settle the books. The first target was Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had been giving Venice trade problems. The Crusaders were understandably confused. They had signed up to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, not attack fellow Christians in what's now Croatia. But Dandolo explained that this was really just a minor detour on the way to Jerusalem. Think of it as a team-building exercise. So, off they went to besiege Zara. The Pope excommunicated everyone involved, which was supposed to be a big deal, but the Venetians had been excommunicated so many times for various commercial activities that they'd basically developed an immunity to papal disapproval. It was like getting a strongly worded letter from your homeowners association, technically official, but not really going to change your behavior. Zara fell quickly, because it turned out that a city designed to defend against pirates wasn't particularly well equipped to handle a full crusading army with siege engines. The Venetians got their wayward trading post back, the Crusaders got to practice their conquering skills, and everyone pretended this was all somehow advancing the cause of Christianity. But Dandolo wasn't done. Oh no, this was just the appetizer. While the Crusaders were congratulating themselves on their successful siege, Dandolo was already planning the main course. He had his eye on the biggest prize in the Eastern Mediterranean, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Now, you might remember that Venice and Byzantium had a complicated relationship. The Byzantines had given the Venetians all those lucrative trading privileges, but they'd also been getting a bit nervous about their increasingly powerful partners. Recent Byzantine emperors had been making noises about renegotiating those trade deals, and some had even dared to grant similar privileges to Venice's competitors. From Dandolo's perspective, this was unacceptable. Venice had invested centuries in building up their Byzantine trade networks, and now the Byzantines wanted to change the rules of the game? This was like your business partner trying to renegotiate your contract right before the biggest deal of your career. So Dandolo proposed another small detour. There was a bit of confusion about who the rightful Byzantine emperor was, he explained. Perhaps the Crusaders could help sort that out. It would only take a few weeks, and Constantinople was practically on the way to Egypt anyway, if you squinted at a map and had a very flexible understanding of Mediterranean geography. The Crusaders, who by this point were starting to suspect they were being manipulated but couldn't quite figure out how to get out of their debt, agreed to yet another detour. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade arrived at the walls of Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, supposedly to restore the rightful emperor and then continue on to Jerusalem. What happened next was less restoration of legitimate authority and more the medieval equivalent of a leveraged buyout. The siege of Constantinople lasted only a few months, and when the city fell, the Crusaders and Venetians not only restored their preferred emperor and left, they divided the entire Byzantine Empire among themselves like they were splitting up a restaurant bill. Venice got the best parts naturally. They claimed a quarter of the Byzantine Empire, including the most profitable trading posts, the most strategic islands, and most of Crete. Dandolo had managed to transform a holy war into the most successful real estate acquisition in medieval history. The blind 90-year-old had outmaneuvered some of the canniest politicians in Europe without ever drawing a sword. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Venice went from being a regional maritime power to controlling a commercial empire that stretched from the lagoon to the Black Sea. They owned ports in Greece, islands in the Aegean, and trading posts throughout what had been the Byzantine Empire. It was like winning the medieval lottery, except instead of buying a ticket, they'd convinced their competitors to pay them to play. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were reduced to a few struggling successor states scattered around Anatolia and Greece. Their 1,000-year empire had been carved up by what they'd always considered their merchant vassals. It was the ultimate humiliation, being conquered not by some barbarian horde or rival empire, but by their own former business partners. And the Crusaders? Well, they never did make it to Jerusalem. Most of them settled down in their new Byzantine territories and tried to figure out how to run an empire they'd accidentally conquered. Some of them probably spent their remaining years wondering how exactly they'd ended up as colonial administrators in Greece when they'd originally signed up to fight Muslims in the Holy Land. But for Venice, the Fourth Crusade was the beginning of their golden age. They now controlled the most profitable trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, had military bases scattered throughout the former Byzantine Empire, and had established themselves as the dominant maritime power in their part of the world, all thanks to a blind nonagenarian who understood that the most effective conquests happen with ledger books, not swords, especially when the pen is being used to write very expensive contracts.
Part 3. The Golden Age and the Art of Making Enemies. So here we are in the 13th century, and Venice is basically living its best life. They've got their new Byzantine territories, their trade routes are humming along nicely, and the gold is flowing into the lagoon like water during high tide. But you know what they say about absolute power and corruption, and the Venetians were about to prove that saying absolutely correct. The thing about becoming a maritime empire is that you inevitably start acting like one. And maritime empires, historically speaking, have had a tendency to be complete bastards to everyone else. Venice was no exception. They approached international relations like a medieval protection racket. Nice merchant fleet you've got there. Shame if something happened to it. By the mid-1200s, Venice had perfected what we might call the art of commercial intimidation. They didn't just control trade routes, they controlled who got to use them. Want to ship goods from Constantinople to Western Europe? Better make sure you're on Venice's good side. Thinking about establishing your own trading post in the Eastern Mediterranean? That would be unfortunate for your health. This is where we need to talk about the Genoese, because if Venice was the successful bully of medieval commerce, Genoa was the scrappy underdog who refused to stay down. The rivalry between these two Italian maritime republics was like a centuries-long bar fight, except the bar was the entire Mediterranean, and the weapons were warships instead of beer bottles. Genoa had been watching Venice's rise with the kind of seething resentment that only comes from being consistently outmaneuvered by your most annoying competitor. While Venice was busy carving up the Byzantine Empire, Genoa had been building its own commercial network, establishing trading posts in the Black Sea, and generally trying to prove that they could be just as ruthlessly mercantile as their Venetian rivals. The problem was that there really wasn't room in the medieval Mediterranean for two dominant maritime powers. It was like having two mafia families trying to control the same neighborhood. Eventually, someone was going to have to go. The first major showdown came in 1264, in what historians call the War of St. Sabas. Now, calling it a war over St. Sabas makes it sound like some kind of religious conflict, but really it was a fight over a monastery in Acre that happened to control some very lucrative commercial privileges in the Holy Land. Both sides claimed the rights to this monastery, and both sides were willing to go to war over what was essentially a medieval strip mall. The Venetians approached this conflict with their usual combination of careful planning and cheerful brutality. They assembled a fleet, sailed to the eastern Mediterranean, and proceeded to systematically destroy Genoese shipping wherever they found it. It was less a naval battle and more a very expensive game of whack-a-mole, played with warships. The Genoese, to their credit, gave as good as they got. They had their own fleet, their own network of allies, and their own cheerful willingness to sink Venetian merchants on sight. For several years, the eastern Mediterranean was basically a free fire zone where Venetian and Genoese ships would attack each other whenever they met, regardless of what they were officially supposed to be doing. This was expensive for everyone involved, but it was particularly expensive for Venice because they had more to lose. They'd invested centuries in building up their eastern trade networks, and now they had to spend a fortune defending them against Genoese raiders. It was like being a successful drug dealer who suddenly has to hire bodyguards because a rival gang moved into the neighborhood. But Venice had one crucial advantage. They were better at this game than anyone else. While the Genoese were brave and determined, the Venetians had turned warfare into a science. They approached each battle like an accounting problem. How do we achieve maximum enemy casualties with minimum cost to ourselves? The decisive moment came in 1298, at the Battle of Corzola. The Venetian fleet, under the command of Andrea Dandolo, yes, another Dandolo, because Venice was basically run by a handful of families who passed power back and forth like a very expensive game of hot potato, met the Genoese fleet in what's now Croatian waters. The battle was a disaster for Venice. The Genoese captured or destroyed most of the Venetian fleet, took thousands of prisoners, and dealt Venice its worst naval defeat in centuries. Among the prisoners was a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, who would spend the next year in a Genoese prison writing about his travels to China. So at least something good came out of the whole mess. But here's the thing about Venice. They were remarkably good at turning disasters into opportunities. The defeat at Corzola was devastating, but it also taught them some valuable lessons about the limits of their power and the importance of not putting all their warships in one place. More importantly, it forced Venice to innovate. They couldn't just rely on superior numbers and better ships anymore. They needed to be smarter, more flexible, and more ruthless than their enemies. So they invested in new technologies, developed new tactics, and most importantly, started thinking more strategically about their long-term goals. This is where we start to see Venice transform from a successful trading state into something more like a modern nation. They developed professional diplomatic corps, established permanent embassies in major European capitals, and created intelligence networks that would have made the Byzantine secret police jealous. They were becoming a real power, not just a rich city-state. The Doge during this period was Pietro Gradenigo, and he was exactly the kind of leader Venice needed during their transition from successful merchants to imperial power brokers. Gradenigo understood that Venice's future lay not just in trade but in territorial expansion on the Italian mainland. The lagoon was all well and good, but if Venice wanted to compete with the emerging powers of Europe, they needed to control more than just shipping routes. So Gradenigo launched what historians call Venice's mainland expansion, which sounds much more dignified than the systematic conquest of everyone who annoyed us. Venice began acquiring territory on the Italian mainland, not through dramatic military campaigns, but through the same patient, methodical approach they'd always used for business deals. They would identify a city or region that would be useful to control, engineer some kind of crisis or conflict that gave them an excuse to intervene, and then gradually absorb their target into the Venetian sphere of influence. It was like a very slow-motion version of modern corporate acquisitions, except with more siege engines. By the early 1300s, Venice controlled not just their original lagoon territories and their eastern Mediterranean empire, but also significant chunks of northeastern Italy. They were no longer just a maritime power, they were becoming a land power as well. And land powers, as they were about to discover, played by different rules than maritime powers. This expansion brought Venice into conflict with other Italian powers who had their own territorial ambitions. The Pope didn't appreciate Venice's encroachment on what he considered church lands. The Holy Roman Emperor had opinions about Venice's activities and what he considered his sphere of influence. And various Italian city-states were getting nervous about their increasingly powerful neighbor. But perhaps most concerning of all, Venice's expansion was putting them on a collision course with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were a rising power in Anatolia and the Balkans, and they had their own ideas about who should control Eastern Mediterranean trade. A conflict was inevitable, and it was going to be the kind of existential struggle that would determine whether Venice's golden age continued or came to an abrupt and expensive end. The stage was being set for the greatest challenge in Venetian history, a series of wars that would test everything they'd learned about commerce, diplomacy, and warfare over the past 600 years. Wars that would force them to choose between their profitable Eastern Empire and their survival as an independent state. But that struggle was still a few decades away. For now, Venice was still riding high on centuries of successful expansion, still confident that their combination of wealth, cunning, and sheer bloody-minded determination could overcome any challenge. They had no idea that their greatest enemy was already sharpening their swords just to cross the Adriatic.
Part 4. When the Turks Came Knocking. Let's drift forward to the 1400s, when Venice was about to discover that being a successful maritime empire comes with some significant downsides. Mainly, that other people start wanting to be successful maritime empires too, and they're not always polite about it. The Ottoman Empire had been quietly expanding for about a century, methodically conquering their way across Anatolia and into the Balkans. They were like that neighbor who starts with a small garden and then gradually absorbs everyone else's yard until they're running a commercial farming operation in what used to be a suburban neighborhood. Except, instead of vegetables, they were cultivating military conquests. By 1453, the Ottomans had done something that European powers had been trying to do for decades. They conquered Constantinople. the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire finally fell, and with it, the political order that had allowed Venice to thrive for centuries. Suddenly, Venice's most important trading partner was gone, replaced by a rapidly expanding Islamic empire with very different ideas about commercial relationships. The Venetians, being Venetians, initially tried to handle this the way they handled everything else, with diplomacy and money. They sent ambassadors to the new Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, with the usual offers of commercial partnerships and mutual benefit. Surely, they reasoned, the Ottomans would want to maintain the profitable trading relationships that had made everyone rich for centuries. Mehmed II listened politely to these proposals, accepted the gifts, and then proceeded to completely ignore everything the Venetians had said. He had his own plans for Eastern Mediterranean trade, and those plans didn't include sharing profits with Italian merchants. It was like offering to collaborate with someone who had just bought out your biggest client and was now planning to compete directly with your business. This led to what historians call the Ottoman-Venetian Wars. The wars might be putting it a bit dramatically. It was more like a very expensive series of misunderstandings, where both sides kept trying to negotiate while simultaneously trying to blow each other's ships out of the water. The first war started in 1463, and it immediately became clear that Venice was facing a very different kind of enemy than they were used to. The Genoese had been rivals, sure, but they were Italian rivals. They played by the same basic rules, understood the same commercial principles, and could be negotiated with using familiar diplomatic languages. The Ottomans were something else entirely. They weren't particularly interested in Venice's traditional approach of buying their way out of conflicts. They had their own sources of wealth, their own military traditions, and, most frustratingly, their own ideas about how Mediterranean trade should work. Ideas that didn't include Venice as a major player. The war dragged on for 16 years, which tells you everything you need to know about how well it was going for everyone involved. Venice threw enormous amounts of money at the problem, hired mercenaries, built new ships, and generally tried to solve the Ottoman issue the way they'd solved every other problem, by outspending it. The Ottomans, meanwhile, just kept expanding. They conquered more territory in the Balkans, established more naval bases, and gradually tightened their control over the trade routes that Venice depended on. It was like watching someone slowly turn off your water supply while you argued about the plumbing bills. Venice's biggest problem was that they were trying to fight a 15th century war with 13th century strategies. They were still thinking like a commercial republic whose main goal was protecting trade routes, while the Ottomans were thinking like an expanding empire whose main goal was territorial conquest. It was a fundamental mismatch in objectives. This became painfully clear during the siege of Negropont in 1470. Negropont was one of Venice's most important fortresses in Greece, a key strategic position that controlled access to the Aegean Sea. The Venetians had held it for centuries, and it was considered practically impregnable. The Ottomans besieged it for a few weeks and then took it, along with the entire Venetian garrison. It was the kind of defeat that makes you question all your previous assumptions about military strategy. Venice had invested enormous resources in making Negropont unassailable, and the Ottomans had made it look easy. The loss of Negropont was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological shock. Venice had grown accustomed to being the dominant power in their part of the Mediterranean, and suddenly they were being outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and no interest in negotiating reasonable settlements. This is where we need to talk about the Venetian response to crisis, because it reveals something important about their character as a state. When faced with an existential threat, Venice didn't panic or make desperate gambles. Instead, they did what they'd always done. They adapted, innovated, and tried to find a way to turn the situation to their advantage. They couldn't match the Ottomans in terms of territorial expansion or military manpower,
So they focused on what they did best: naval warfare and commercial innovation. They developed new ship designs, improved their artillery, and most importantly, they started investing heavily in alternative trade routes. This is when Venice began seriously exploring Atlantic trade. While the Spanish and Portuguese were busy conquering the Americas, Venice was quietly establishing commercial relationships with Northern European powers, trying to build new networks that didn't depend on Ottoman-controlled territories. It was like a medieval version of economic diversification, except the stakes were national survival rather than quarterly profits. Venice was learning, perhaps for the first time in their history, what it meant to be a middle power in a world increasingly dominated by continental empires. The peace treaty that ended the First Ottoman-Venetian War in 1479 was basically Venice admitting that the old rules no longer applied. They agreed to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, acknowledged Ottoman control over much of their former Eastern Empire, and accepted a significantly reduced role in Eastern Mediterranean trade. For a state that had spent centuries dictating terms to other powers, this was deeply humiliating. But the Venetians, being pragmatic above all else, accepted the new reality and started planning for the long term. If they couldn't be the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean anymore, they would find other ways to remain relevant. This period of adjustment coincided with some interesting developments in Venetian internal politics. The Doge during the late 1400s was a series of increasingly elderly men who seemed to represent Venice's transition from dynamic expansion to careful management of decline. They weren't the bold empire builders of previous centuries. They were cautious administrators trying to navigate an increasingly complicated world. One of the most memorable was Doge Francesco Foscari, who ruled for 34 years and presided over both Venice's greatest territorial expansion on the Italian mainland and their first serious defeats by the Ottomans. Foscari was like that CEO who builds a company into a major corporation and then has to watch it struggle to adapt to changing market conditions. His reign was marked by constant warfare, enormous expenses, and the gradual realization that Venice's traditional strategies weren't working anymore. He was eventually forced to abdicate by the Council of Ten, Venice's governing body, in what was essentially a corporate coup. The official reason was his age and declining health, but really it was because he'd become a symbol of Venice's failure to adapt to the Ottoman threat. The tragedy of Francesco Foscari became the subject of poems, operas, and historical romances. But the real tragedy was what his fall represented. Venice was no longer confident in its ability to solve problems through bold action and unlimited spending. They were becoming a reactive power, responding to threats rather than creating opportunities. But Venice was nothing if not resilient, and they were about to prove that even a declining maritime empire could still cause enormous amounts of trouble for its enemies. The 16th century was going to bring new challenges, new wars, and new opportunities for Venice to demonstrate that reports of their demise had been greatly exaggerated.
Part 5. The Last Hurrah and the Art of Expensive Nostalgia. So here we are in the 1500s, and Venice is having what we might politely call an identity crisis. They're no longer the dominant maritime power they used to be, but they're not quite ready to admit it yet. It's like watching someone who used to be the coolest kid in high school trying to relive their glory days at the 20-year reunion, except with warships and international diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire wasn't going anywhere, and if anything, they were getting more aggressive about expanding their influence in the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, and yes, he really was called that because apparently the Ottomans didn't believe in modest titles, the empire was reaching the peak of its power and ambition. Venice found itself in the awkward position of being a minor player in conflicts between major powers. The Ottomans were fighting the Habsburgs, the French were fighting the Spanish,
and everyone was fighting everyone else in various complicated combinations that changed depending on the day of the week and the phase of the moon. Venice's main goal was to avoid getting completely crushed by any of these larger powers while still maintaining some semblance of independence. This led to some interesting diplomatic gymnastics. Venice would ally with the French against the Habsburgs, then secretly negotiate with the Habsburgs against the French, while simultaneously trying to maintain trading relationships with the Ottomans and avoid giving anyone a good reason to invade the lagoon. It was like playing four-dimensional chess while blindfolded and slightly drunk. The most dramatic example of this came in 1571 with the Battle of Lepanto. Now, Lepanto is one of those battles that sounds much more glorious in the history books than it probably felt at the time. It's been celebrated as the great Christian victory that saved Europe from Ottoman expansion, with all the usual heroic imagery of cross-bearing knights charging into battle against the infidel hordes. The reality was a bit more complicated. Yes, it was a Christian victory, and yes, it did significantly damage Ottoman naval power, but it was also essentially a very expensive demonstration that Venice could still build impressive fleets and participate in major naval battles, even if they couldn't really afford to do so anymore. Venice contributed about 100 ships to the Christian alliance, which was commanded by Don John of Austria, one of those dashing young nobles who looked great in portraits and had a talent for dramatic military gestures. The Venetian contingent was commanded by Sebastiano Venier, who was 75 years old and had the kind of maritime experience that only comes from spending 60 years trying not to get killed by pirates. The battle itself was a massacre, but in the good way, if you happen to be Christian. The Ottoman fleet was basically destroyed. Thousands of Ottoman sailors were killed or captured, and the Christian galley slaves rowing Ottoman ships were freed. It was the kind of total victory that medieval chroniclers loved to write about, complete with divine intervention and miraculous coincidences. For Venice, Lepanto was both a triumph and a revelation. The triumph was obvious. They'd participated in the greatest naval victory of the century and proved they could still build fleets that could compete with the major powers. The revelation was how much it had cost them. Venice had basically bankrupted themselves to participate in this glorious victory. The irony was that Lepanto, while strategically significant, didn't actually solve Venice's fundamental problems. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a few years, continued to dominate Eastern Mediterranean trade, and remained a constant threat to Venetian territories. Venice had won a great battle, but not the war, and they couldn't afford many more victories like that. This is where Venice began its transformation from a military power to something more like a cultural and diplomatic center. They couldn't compete with the major European powers in terms of military strength or territorial expansion, so they focused on becoming indispensable in other ways. Venice became the place where European diplomats went to have discreet conversations with Ottoman representatives. It was neutral enough to be trusted by both sides, wealthy enough to provide appropriate hospitality, and exotic enough to make the whole experience feel like something special. Venice was becoming the medieval equivalent of Switzerland, except with better food and more interesting architecture. This period also saw the rise of some of Venice's most memorable individual doges, partly because they had more time to develop interesting personalities when they weren't constantly planning military campaigns. Take Doge Leonardo Loredan, who ruled from 1501 to 1521 and managed to look both wise and slightly constipated in every official portrait. Loredan presided over Venice's transition from expansion to consolidation, and he approached the job with the kind of careful, bureaucratic precision that suggested he understood he was managing decline rather than building empire. He was less a war leader and more a very expensive city manager, focused on maintaining Venice's existing privileges rather than acquiring new ones. But the real character from this period was Doge Andrea Gritti, who ruled from 1523 to 1538 and seemed determined to prove that Venice could still surprise people.
Gritty had been a successful merchant and diplomat before becoming Doge, and he brought a business's perspective to what was increasingly a business problem. Gritty understood that Venice's future lay not in competing directly with the major powers, but in finding ways to make themselves useful to everyone. He invested heavily in Venice's infrastructure, beautified the city, and generally tried to turn Venice into the kind of place that powerful people wanted to visit and do business in. It was like turning from a manufacturing company into a luxury service provider. Gritty's reign also saw the beginning of what historians call Venice's cultural golden age, though that's partly a polite way of saying the period when they stopped being a major military power and started being really good at parties. Venice became famous for its art, its music, its festivals, and its general atmosphere of refined debauchery. The city attracted artists like Titian and Tintoretto, writers like Pietro Aretino, and various other cultural figures who found Venice's combination of wealth, tolerance, and political stability conducive to creative work. It was like the Renaissance-era artists' colony, except with better funding and more networking opportunities. This cultural development wasn't just decorative, it was strategic. Venice was creating soft power to replace the hard power they could no longer afford to maintain. If you couldn't intimidate your rivals with warships, you could at least impress them with your sophistication and make them want to be associated with your brand. The downside of this strategy was that it required Venice to maintain extremely expensive appearances while their actual wealth was steadily declining. They were like someone living in a mansion they can't afford to maintain, putting on lavish dinner parties while quietly selling the furniture for groceries. Venice's financial problems were becoming serious by the mid-1500s. The Ottoman wars had been expensive, maintaining their territorial empire was costly, and their traditional sources of revenue were being eroded by competition from Atlantic trade routes. The Spanish and Portuguese had found ways to Asia that didn't go through Venice, and Northern European merchants were establishing direct relationships with Ottoman and Asian traders. This led to some creative financial engineering that would have impressed modern investment bankers. Venice started selling government offices, borrowing against future tax revenues, and generally engaging in the kind of sophisticated financial manipulation that suggested they understood their problems were structural rather than temporary. But they weren't ready to give up yet. Venice still had cards to play, and they were about to demonstrate that even a declining power could still cause significant problems for their enemies. The 17th century was going to bring new conflicts, new challenges, and new opportunities for Venice to prove that they weren't quite finished making history yet.
Part 6. The Spectacular Finale and the Beginning of the End. Let's float into the 1600s, when Venice was about to embark on what historians politely call their final period of military significance, which is a nice way of saying the last time they managed to annoy everyone before settling into comfortable irrelevance. By now, Venice had been dealing with the Ottoman Empire for over 2 centuries, and both sides had developed the kind of weary familiarity that comes from fighting the same enemy for multiple generations. It was like a very expensive family feud, where both sides knew exactly how to hurt each other most efficiently. The spark for Venice's final great military adventure came from Crete. Venice had controlled Crete since the Fourth Crusade. You remember, that time they accidentally conquered the Byzantine Empire, and it had become one of their most valuable remaining possessions. Crete was strategically located, commercially profitable, and most importantly, it was one of the few places where Venice could still pretend to be a major power. The Ottomans, naturally, wanted it. They'd been gradually absorbing Venice's eastern Mediterranean territories for 2 centuries, and Crete was basically the last significant prize left. It was like that final piece of cake at a dinner party. Everyone knows who's going to end up eating it, but there's still going to be some polite negotiation first. The War of Candia, as historians call it, began in 1645 and lasted for 24 years.
24 years! To put that in perspective, that's longer than World War I and World War II combined. It was the kind of conflict that started with young men fighting and ended with their sons taking over the family business of trying not to get killed by Turks. The siege of Candia itself, the capital city of Crete, lasted 21 years. 21 years of constant warfare over a single city. It became legendary throughout Europe as the longest siege in history, which sounds impressive until you realize that it mostly meant 21 years of people sitting in trenches, occasionally shooting at each other, and generally wishing they were somewhere else. Venice threw everything they had at defending Crete. They hired French engineers to design new fortifications, brought in military advisors from across Europe, and generally spent money like they were still the dominant Mediterranean power. It was like someone taking out a second mortgage to fund a very expensive midlife crisis. The problem was that the Ottomans were perfectly willing to spend 24 years conquering one island because they had the resources to sustain that kind of long-term commitment. Venice, meanwhile, was essentially bleeding money for over 2 decades to defend a territory that was becoming less profitable with each year of warfare. The end came in 1669, when Venice finally admitted defeat and surrendered Crete to the Ottomans. It was the end of an era. Venice's last major territorial possession in the eastern Mediterranean was gone, and with it, their last real claim to being a significant military power. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Venice's response to losing Crete wasn't despair or resignation. Instead, they decided to double down on the one strategy that had always worked for them: making money in ways that annoyed other people. Unable to compete as a territorial power, Venice pivoted to what we might call the entertainment industry. They'd always been good at throwing impressive parties and providing luxurious accommodations for wealthy visitors, but now they turned it into their primary economic strategy. Venice became the Las Vegas of early modern Europe. The transformation was remarkably rapid. Within a generation of losing Crete, Venice had reinvented itself as Europe's premier destination for aristocratic tourism. Wealthy nobles from across the continent would travel to Venice to experience its famous carnival, visit its opera houses, and generally engage in the kind of expensive debauchery that was frowned upon in their home countries, but perfectly acceptable in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the lagoon. This period produced some of Venice's most colorful Doge personalities, partly because being Doge was no longer a job that required serious military or diplomatic skills. Instead, it became something more like being the mayor of a very upscale resort town, focused on maintaining the city's reputation as a sophisticated and welcoming destination for international wealth. Take Doge Francisco Morosini, who ruled from 1688 to 1994 and had the distinction of being Venice's last genuinely successful military commander. Morosini had actually managed to reconquer parts of Greece from the Ottomans in the 1680s, which was such an unexpected development that other European powers weren't quite sure how to react. It was like your elderly uncle suddenly taking up extreme sports and being surprisingly good at it. Unfortunately, Morosini's conquests in Greece proved to be temporary. The Ottomans eventually reconquered everything he'd taken, and Venice was back to its default position of being a minor power with expensive tastes. But Morosini's brief success had demonstrated that Venice could still surprise people when properly motivated. More typical was Doge Sylvester Valier, who ruled from 1694 to 1700, and seemed to understand that his job was less military leader and more chief executive of a hospitality corporation. Valier focused on maintaining Venice's infrastructure, supporting its cultural institutions, and generally ensuring that visiting aristocrats had pleasant experiences that would encourage them to return with their friends. This shift toward cultural and economic rather than military significance produced some interesting changes in Venetian society.
The old merchant patrician families who had built the empire were gradually being replaced by a newer aristocracy that specialized in what we might call lifestyle management. They weren't empire builders, they were impresarios. Venice's famous carnival became institutionalized during this period, transforming from a seasonal religious observance into a months-long festival that attracted visitors from across Europe. The carnival wasn't just entertainment, it was economic strategy. Venice was commodifying its own exotic reputation, turning its history and culture into a tourist attraction. The city's famous courtesans also became an integral part of this economic model. Venetian courtesans weren't just sex workers, they were sophisticated entertainers who provided intellectual companionship, cultural education, and social networking opportunities for wealthy visitors. They were like a combination of escort service, finishing school, and professional networking organization. This might sound degrading, but it was actually quite lucrative and socially prestigious within Venetian society. The most successful courtesans were wealthy, influential women who maintained elaborate households, supported artists and writers, and played significant roles in the city's cultural life. They had transformed what could have been economic desperation into a sophisticated service industry. Venice's transformation into a tourist destination also coincided with the rise of what historians call the Grand Tour, the practice of wealthy young Europeans traveling extensively to complete their education and experience different cultures. Venice became a mandatory stop on any respectable Grand Tour, which meant a steady stream of wealthy visitors eager to spend money on authentic Italian experiences. The city adapted beautifully to this new economic reality. Hotels improved their services, restaurants refined their cuisine, and local artisans began producing the kind of luxury goods that wealthy tourists wanted to buy as souvenirs. Venice was becoming what we might recognize as a modern tourist economy, complete with price gouging and customer service complaints. But underneath all this cultural sophistication and economic adaptation, Venice was dealing with some serious structural problems. Their population was declining. Their traditional industries were being undercut by competition from other European centers, and their political system was becoming increasingly oligarchic and resistant to reform. The Council of Ten, which had been Venice's governing body for centuries, had evolved into something resembling a very exclusive private club whose main function was preserving the privileges of a few dozen patrician families. It was efficient in its way, but it wasn't particularly good at adapting to changing circumstances or developing innovative solutions to new problems. More concerningly, Venice's military capabilities were basically non-existent by the early 1700s. They maintained a small navy for ceremonial purposes and to deal with pirates, but they couldn't seriously defend themselves against any major European power. They were dependent on diplomacy, neutrality, and the general assumption that conquering Venice wouldn't be worth the trouble. This strategy worked reasonably well for several decades, but it left Venice vulnerable to the kind of major European conflicts that periodically rearranged the continental political order. And such a conflict was coming, one that would finally end Venice's thousand-year run as an independent state and transform it into something entirely different.
Part 7. Napoleon and the End of Everything. So here we are in the 1790s, and Venice is basically coasting on reputation and hoping nobody notices how little actual power they have left. It's like that friend who still acts like they're wealthy long after their trust fund ran out. Impressive performance, but ultimately unsustainable. Venice had managed to stay neutral during most of the 18th century's various European wars, partly through skilled diplomacy and partly because nobody really considered them worth conquering. They weren't a threat to anyone, they weren't particularly valuable strategically, and their main contribution to European politics was providing a nice place for diplomats to meet and discuss more important matters.
This comfortable irrelevance was about to be shattered by Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had strong opinions about traditional European political arrangements and an unfortunate tendency to act on those opinions with large armies. Napoleon represented everything that Venice's political system was fundamentally unsuited to handle. He was young, revolutionary, dismissive of traditional authority, and most problematically, he actually had the military power to impose his will on anyone who disagreed with him. Venice's usual strategies of diplomatic maneuvering and expensive hospitality weren't going to work on someone who conquered countries as a hobby. The final crisis began in 1796 during Napoleon's Italian campaign. The French Revolutionary Wars were reshaping the entire European political order, and Napoleon was systematically conquering the Italian states that had maintained their independence for centuries. Venice watched nervously as French armies swept across northern Italy, toppling governments and establishing satellite republics wherever they went. Venice's leadership, such as it was, tried their traditional approach of attempting to stay neutral while quietly negotiating with all sides. They sent diplomatic missions to both the Austrians and the French, offered commercial concessions to whoever seemed to be winning at any given moment, and generally behaved like someone trying to remain friends with both parties in a very messy divorce. The problem was that Napoleon didn't particularly care about Venice's neutrality, and he definitely didn't care about their historical precedents or traditional privileges. He looked at Venice and saw an anachronistic oligarchy sitting on valuable territory that could be better used to advance French strategic interests. It was like a corporate raider evaluating a struggling company. The brand might have sentimental value, but the assets were what really mattered. The immediate cause of Venice's downfall was characteristically absurd. In April 1797, French and Austrian forces were fighting near Verona, which was technically Venetian territory. Some Venetian soldiers, apparently confused about whose side they were supposed to be on, fired on French forces. A French naval captain was killed during the incident, which gave Napoleon exactly the pretext he'd been looking for. Napoleon declared that Venice had violated their neutrality by attacking French forces, and that this act of aggression couldn't be tolerated by the French Republic. It was the kind of legal reasoning that would have been laughed out of any medieval court, but Napoleon had 50,000 soldiers to back up his interpretation of international law. The Venetian government's response to this crisis was entirely predictable. They appointed a committee to study the problem. The Committee of Public Safety, because apparently they couldn't resist borrowing terminology from the French Revolution, spent weeks debating their options while French armies advanced steadily toward the lagoon. Their options, as they turned out, were fairly limited. They could fight, which would have been noble and suicidal, given that Venice's military consisted of a few hundred ceremonial guards and some very old cannons. They could flee, which would have been practical but embarrassing, or they could surrender, which is what they eventually decided to do. On May 12, 1797, the Great Council of Venice met for the last time and voted to dissolve the Venetian Republic. It was a remarkably anticlimactic end to over 1,000 years of independence. No dramatic final battle, no heroic last stand, just a group of elderly patricians taking a vote and then going home to pack their valuables. Doge Ludovico Mainin, the last Doge of Venice, supposedly removed his dusonal cap and declared, "This will not be needed anymore." It was the kind of understated dignity that Venetians had always specialized in, even when their world was ending around them. Napoleon's forces occupied Venice without resistance, and the new French administration immediately began the process of dismantling the political and economic systems that had sustained the Republic for centuries. The Golden Book, which had recorded the names of Venice's noble families since the 13th century, was burned in the Piazza San Marco. The Doge's palace was converted into government offices. The arsenal, where Venice's great fleets had been built for centuries, was partially destroyed. It was systematic cultural vandalism, but it was also practical politics. Napoleon understood that Venice's power had always rested on its unique institutions and its carefully maintained monopolies. Destroy those institutions, and Venice would become just another Italian city, remarkable mainly for its unusual architecture and its tourist attractions. The human cost of this transition was significant but largely hidden from the historical record. The patrician families who had governed Venice for centuries found themselves suddenly irrelevant, their titles meaningless, and their traditional sources of income eliminated. Some adapted by becoming part of the new French administration. Others withdrew into private life, and a few simply left the city entirely. But perhaps more importantly, the ordinary Venetians, the artisans, merchants, sailors, and workers who had actually made the Republic function found themselves living in a fundamentally different world. The guilds that had regulated their trades for centuries were abolished. The commercial networks that had provided their livelihoods were disrupted. The cultural traditions that had defined their identity were officially discouraged as remnants of the feudal past.
Napoleon's administration lasted only until 1805, when Venice was handed over to the Austrian Empire as part of a larger diplomatic resettlement. The Austrians were less revolutionary than the French, but they were equally uninterested in restoring Venice's independence. Venice became a provincial city in a continental empire, governed from Vienna by bureaucrats who had never seen the lagoon and couldn't understand why anyone would want to build a city in a swamp. This might have been the end of the story, another medieval city-state absorbed into a modern nation-state, its unique character gradually eroded by administrative efficiency and economic rationalization. But Venice had one final trick to play, and it was perhaps their most successful innovation since the Fourth Crusade. They became a tourist destination. Not just a place that attracted some wealthy visitors, but the tourist destination, the essential stop on any educated European's cultural education. Venice's political independence was gone forever, but its cultural significance was about to reach heights that would have astonished the medieval Doges. The transformation was remarkably rapid. Within a generation of losing their independence, Venetians had figured out how to commodify their own history. They turned their former palaces into hotels, their ancient churches into must-see attractions, and their traditional festivals into scheduled entertainment for paying customers. It was cultural capitalism at its most sophisticated. Lord Byron, the famous Romantic poet, spent several years in Venice during the 1810s and helped establish its reputation as a place of decadent beauty and romantic melancholy. His descriptions of Venice as a dying but magnificent civilization attracted other writers, artists, and cultural tourists who wanted to experience authentic European history before it disappeared entirely. This wasn't entirely cynical. Venice really was extraordinarily beautiful, and its history really was uniquely fascinating. But the Venetians showed remarkable skill in packaging that beauty and history into experiences that wealthy visitors were willing to pay premium prices to enjoy. They had transformed themselves from a political entity into a lifestyle brand. The irony is that Venice's success as a tourist destination was built partly on nostalgia for the very political independence that had been destroyed by Napoleon. Visitors came to experience the romance of the old Venetian Republic, to imagine themselves as characters in the great historical drama that had once played out in the lagoon. They were consuming a carefully curated version of the past that emphasized the glamorous parts while glossing over the more mundane realities of medieval commercial politics. And so Venice survived, not as an independent state, but as something perhaps more durable. A dream. A place where people could come to experience a more romantic version of European history, where the architecture was photogenic, the food was excellent, and the tour guides were happy to tell you stories about Doges and merchants and maritime empires without dwelling too much on the less picturesque details of medieval warfare and economic exploitation. By the mid-19th century, Venice had completed its transformation from political entity to cultural artifact. It was a city that existed primarily to be visited, experienced, and remembered. The gondoliers who had once been the backbone of Venetian commerce became costumed performers, providing authentic experiences for tourists. The palaces that had housed the families that governed a maritime empire became hotels where those tourists could sleep surrounded by the ghosts of former greatness. It was, in its way, a perfect ending to the Venetian story. A civilization that had always been about adaptation, innovation, and the transformation of challenging circumstances into profitable opportunities had managed one final adaptation. They had turned the end of their political relevance into the beginning of their cultural immortality. And that, my sleepy listeners, is how an empire of swamp-dwelling refugees managed to conquer half the Mediterranean, lose it all to a short French general, and then reinvent themselves as the world's most successful tourist trap. Venice had always been a city that survived by being useful to powerful people, and in the end they figured out how to be useful to everyone by providing a beautiful place to visit and a romantic story to take home. So the next time you see a photo of a gondolier navigating the canals of Venice, remember that you're looking at the heir to a 1,000-year tradition of Venetian adaptation and survival. The empire may be gone, but the entrepreneurial spirit lives on, one overpriced boat ride at a time. Sweet dreams, and may your own empires, whatever they may be, prove as resilient as the Venetian Republic's remarkable ability to reinvent themselves whenever the world changed around them.